Your questions answered, repeated readings, reader's theater, text complexity, and a poem about a swimming ool. It's coming up on the Teaching Literacy Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Teaching Literacy Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Downs. I am a former fourth grade teacher. I'm an elementary literacy coordinator for a local school district. I have a PhD in literacy from Utah State University, and I am someone who just wants to know more about reading. I have a treat for all of you today. I think this episode was one of the funnest I've had recording, although I think I say that with just about every episode I do. I love doing this podcast and being able to talk with researchers and think real hard and critically about how do we support kiddos in literacy in meaningful ways. And this episode it's a great one. I'm really excited for it. On this episode, this is the long-awaited Q&A episode with Dr. Timothy Rasinski and Dr. Chase Young. Back in July, we sent out a survey just to the masses on the internet of what folks wanted to know about literacy. And so we had folks be able just to submit their questions, and then we discussed and sort of found ones that we wanted to talk about. And that's what this episode has with you. It's Dr. Chase Young and Dr. Timothy Rasinski answering your questions, and we really have a great time. Dr. Chase Young is a returning interviewer on the Teaching Literacy Podcast. I interviewed him about the book that he co-authored with Tim Rasinski called Tiered Fluency Instruction. You can go check out that book, those episodes. It's like episodes 4 and 5, really, really early on. But Chase Young is a professor at the School of Teaching and Learning at Sam Houston State University in Texas. And congratulations to Chase, because he recently was just promoted to a full professor. So congratulations, Chase. And Dr. Timothy Rasinski is a professor of reading education at the Reading and Writing Center at Kent State University. Very grateful for the time that they spent in designing this episode and sending out the questionnaires. And we really yielded a worldwide response with the questions that we received. So thanks to those that were able to input questions. I apologize we weren't able to answer all of them, but the episode would have been very long had we opted to do that. So I hope you enjoy the episode and stick around after the show for my 2 cents on reading fluency. Dr. Timothy Rasinski, welcome to the Teaching Literacy Podcast, and Dr. Chase Young, welcome back to the Teaching Literacy Podcast.
Thanks, Jake. Glad to be with you.
Yep, always good to be here.
So this is a special episode. I've never done anything like this before. I'm glad that you both would join me here. We sent out questions to the masses and what folks wanted to know about oral reading fluency or reading fluency, and so this is a Q&A episode where we're going to go through some of the responses that we received and see if we can help folks out with their questions in reading fluency. We had a broad response, and I was actually surprised with, obviously, there was a strong response here in the United States, but we had questions from the Philippines, from Nigeria, from Brazil. So that was really fun to see such a worldwide response to questions on oral reading fluency. People want to know. So Let's get into it. I first wanted to ask both of you, Dr. Young and Dr. Rasinski, what initially drew you towards reading research in general, but then in specific reading fluency?
Yeah, since I'm slightly older than Chase, I guess I'll take the lead on that. And first of all, Jake, please feel free to call us Tim and Chase, make it a little bit more informal. For me, it actually began as a teacher back in the, I hate to say, the mid to late 1970s. I was working outside of Omaha, Nebraska as an intervention teacher, elementary school. And I was working on my master's degree, and I thought I knew my stuff. I'm working with these kids, and for the most part, I was able to help them out. But there were these kids that just didn't seem to budge. I couldn't budge them off the dime. And these were the kids that were the not so fluent ones. They were the robot readers, excessively slow. They got their words right, but weren't terribly fluent. Well, fortunately for me, the professors at the time had us reading some of these articles that were beginning to appear on fluency. Jay Samuels, The Method of Repeated Readings, Carol Chomsky, After Decoding, Then What? After you teach kids phonics, but they're still not making progress, then what? And of course, her answer was fluency. So I began to just play around with these things and apply them as best I could in my own situation. And what happened was these kids began to take off. I mean, some of them literally began to, just explode in terms of their reading achievement. Others not so much, but they were still making progress. So that convinced me that there's something to this. And so when I went on to my doctoral degree at Ohio State, I decided that's what I wanted to take a look at in terms of my dissertation study. And what we did was created a model, a statistical model of fluency, and we demonstrated that among third graders and fifth graders, it was a significant contributor, not only to comprehension, overall reading proficiency. So that's how I got my feet wet on this, and been on it ever since. So, and I think I've been pretty pleased with how things have been turning out in terms of our recognition of fluency and its importance. Chase, what do you have?
Yeah, well, similar to that, it all began in the classroom. I was a second grade teacher, fresh out of the gate, and I thought I had all the answers, but I sure didn't. Those first year kids could probably sue me. So I decided that I needed to do some more reading and some more research and figure out how to best serve these kids. And I remember, implementing a balanced literacy model, but my favorite part of the day turned out to be fluency because it seemed to be more fun. There were activities that got us interacting and in small groups. So, and I read a lot about those in this book called The Fluent Reader by Tim. And so I guess my interest in fluency started more practically and not necessarily research. But as I moved into the role of a reading interventionist, similar to Tim, they didn't send me all the kids that were good to go. They sent me, the tough cases, and I started researching some of the reading fluency interventions from the 60s and 70s. My goodness, they are timeless. And I saw kids also explode, and I can remember their faces right now of, coming in and being a couple years behind grade level and then spending 10, 18 weeks of, intense reading fluency interventions and watching them read on grade level and tell me about their favorite authors and exit RTI, which was something that was foreign to me at the time. So, I became a believer too. And just like Tim, I've been on it ever since.
If I can chip in my 2 cents of how reading fluency caught my eye is when I was going through my doc program, it was probably about my second year, and I started to read articles on reading fluency, and some of those from the 80s, Dick Allington and R.J. Samuels, and then some of the more recent stuff. And I just sort of started to feel that what researchers were talking about reading fluency in a different way than what I was sometimes seeing implemented in practice and implemented in my own classroom. It made me think long and hard about my fluency practices. And I kind of came from a place of being ambivalent towards fluency, towards really embracing it and saying it is a beautiful, beautiful thing when it's sort of understood and implemented accordingly. So I'm hoping that this episode can help target some of that and be able just to help clarify how are researchers talking about fluency and how do we see it and how might that be maybe a little bit of a paradigm shift from how it's, from its sort of implementation in the classroom, whether that's been implied or explicit.
Yeah, Jake, when you mentioned having that experience, are you talking about stopwatch reading and getting kids to read faster than the day before?
Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty much the case around the country. And that's where Chase and I have actually been playing around with this idea. And actually we've written about it recently in Reading Research Quarterly and some others about the art of teaching reading fluency. It's not just science, but when we take that approach that it's an art. And if you think about it, having kids read for the purpose of reading fast isn't very artful, but having kids rehearse in order to put on a reader's theater performance or a poetry slam, that is artful and it's authentic. And as you were saying, Chase, kids really dig that stuff. They get into it.
They do.
Yeah. Let's get into the questions. I wanted to start with this one right out of the gate because it's probably the most technical question that we received. So if you're not a technical person, you can just skip forward a minute or two. But I think it's a great way to frame some of the research that is being conducted. So, and I'm probably going to pronounce this name incorrectly, but Jerlaine Hickman from Brazil wants to ask, is there any study on reading fluency using neuroimaging? If yes, who or which institution is studying this area? And I think, Chase, you're doing a little bit of work looking at neuroimaging research that other folks have done in neuroimaging. Would you perhaps want to start elaborating on that?
Yeah, Jake, before I turn it over to Chase, I just wanted to do a shout out to Jelani. That's the pronunciation of her name. She's from Brazil. And she spent a year with us at Kent State. And so she's done some really remarkable work in the area of fluency in Portuguese. So just say hi, Jelani, if you're listening, and I'll let Chase take it from here.
Sure. Awesome. Small world, right? I love it. So as far as who and where, I can point you towards Vanderbilt University, where they're doing a lot in their work with the fMRI and neuroimaging, not just with reading fluency, but quite a few other processes in reading. They have there's a guy named James Booth who got a lot of funding he started a brain development lab, and you can actually go to that website. It's on Vanderbilt's website, and you can read all the publications that they have from there. But also there happens to be a website called Open Neuro, where you can download all of the data. There's like 3,000 data sets just from the brain development lab at Vanderbilt, but then there's also tons of others. It's pretty technical. Don't know how crazy you want to get with that. But the files are a little complicated to download. But there's tutorials and things. Once you figure that out, it's even more complicated to read them. But yeah, there is work being done. And I think related to fluency, one of the biggest things they look at is automaticity and its role in reading fluency. They have done fMRIs in what I'm going to sound fancy. It's the ventral occipital temporal cortex, which seems to be extremely important for word recognition recall. The more efficient that part of the brain becomes is associated with higher reading ability. So that's, again, more evidence that we need our readers to become more automatic so that they can focus their cognition on other processes. I don't know if you wanted to hear all that, but
that's great. I think anything fMRI is or neuroimaging or otherwise is really incredibly interesting. And that part about automaticity, I think that's a really important part that sometimes misses the translation into practice, where like when we're measuring rate, it's really not rate we care about. It's the automaticity. And so the rate's just serving as a proxy. And, schools tend to be short on fMRI machines to measure automaticity in the part of the brain you mentioned, Chase. But rate is just a proxy for the automaticity. And that's, I think, an area with neuroimaging and brain studies where, obviously that area can be explored more. But in the classroom, we can use rate because it's a pretty good proxy.
Well, interventions that also focus on the multiple components of reading fluency, including prosody. Actually, you see glucose burn more in the brain because, you're looking at this, the automatic processing area of the brain. But once you start bringing in prosody and expression, parts of the right side of the brain start to light up as well. So you're actually exercising more of the whole reading system.
So this wasn't one of the questions, but I'm going to ask this one right out of the gate. So you mentioned prosody, which is reading with expression. I've heard Tim Shannon talk about reading with language, making it sound like language. How do you measure prosody? How might a classroom teacher be able to do that in a reasonable way without a brain imaging?
Well, that's where we tap into our own expertise as teachers. Teachers listen to kids read it every day. They know what good reading sounds like. What we need is something to guide us. And I'm going to toot my own horn here. Jerry Zutel, another colleague of mine and myself, several years ago, we created what we called a multidimensional fluency rubric. And basically, it looks at several dimensions of prosody or fluency. One being rate, actually. But also things such as pace, not pacing, but expression, volume, confidence, phrasing, all those various features that we might associate with prosody. And simply listen to kids read for a minute or so and rate them on a 4-point scale on each of those dimensions. And it gives you a pretty good indication of where kids are. The National Assessment of Educational Progress has used something similar to that in their fluency studies, where they rate kids on it. I think it's only a 4 or 6 point scale.
Yeah, it's 4.
And they get quite remarkable correlations between that rating kids' prosody in this very holistic sort of way and their overall reading performance. Is quite a strong correlation there. So that's one way, without getting too technical, getting into the machines that listen to kids read and such.
And the multidimensional fluency scale, I'll just chip in. It's really user friendly. It's great.
It's evolved over the years. The first time we did it, I think we had 3 dimensions, and I think we expanded it a little bit more, made it a little bit more, what's the right word? More descriptive. And another place to find it actually is on my website, timrasinski.com, under resources, the more recent version of that.
Yeah, I think my favorite dimension there, Tim, in the MDFS is pace, because it's linked to rate, but that's not what it's called. And you use language like appropriate pace. And we know that reading different types of text that we read at different paces for a reason. Something more technical, we're going to slow down, and we're going to be really thinking about the vocabulary and things. And we may read a little bit, at a higher pace in fiction. So I love that language. That's way better than rate.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chase, that it's not just straight speed. It's using being intentional on how you read. One of the things I really like about these kind of rubrics is that I know teachers, and I'm sure you guys do as well, who've actually translated them into kid language and then put these on display so students can rate themselves using language that is more descriptive for them. So they develop that metacognitive awareness of what it means to be a fluent reader.
That's wonderful. Is that on your website too, Tim?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
Okay, it's out there.
It's out there.
You can, my email, man, I'll get it here. Yeah, there you go. It's probably out there, I'm sure.
All right, let's keep moving along. Candy Cox from Texas is asking, when looking at fluency and struggling readers, should the modeling be with books on their level, or is it appropriate to model higher level books and get the same results? And I love this question. So
before y'all take this question, now I got to give a shout out. That is Candy Cox. She is my student right now. She's taking statistics.
Way to go, Candy.
And she's surviving. Take it away, guys.
Okay, I'll take a stab at that one. Good question, Candy, because oftentimes, the conventional wisdom is to put kids into instructional level material, and of course, if you're a struggling reader, that's going to put you in a material that's below where you're actually assigned in terms of your grade level. I like to go back to a study done by Steve Stahl, the great Steve Stahl, working with second graders in Georgia. And he found that repeated readings and assisted reading, these things actually worked with second graders, especially struggling readers. But what he found was the greatest gains was when the kids were given material that was slightly difficult at their frustration level. And, I remember getting into conversations with him about that, how can we explain this? This flies against conventional wisdom. But the point we made was what you're doing is you're giving, if you want to accelerate kids' reading growth, we do have to challenge them. But when you do, you got to give them support. And that support can come in the form of modeling the text for the kids before they read on their own, read it with the kids, have the kids rehearse on their own. And so I really like that idea of challenging kids. We can't stick with the way things are. We need to work, especially for our struggling readers, to try to accelerate that progress. And I think that's one way to do. I think another point to keep in mind is interest. If kids are interested in something, they're willing to stick with it, to learn to read something well. And so keep it, I like to say interest trumps difficulty. So find out what kids are interested in. And one of the things we often do is try to find material that is seasonal. So here we are, in September, Constitution Day is coming up here in the next few weeks, middle of September. Why not have kids learn to read the preamble to the Constitution? Things what I used to do as a kid, we used to have to do this. Or perhaps come November, the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, we have students actually learn if not the entire speech by Mr. Lincoln, at least a portion of it. That's a pretty challenging text, but knowing that it is reflected something in history, knowing that it's something that connects kids to Mr. Lincoln, it can be quite motivating for them, and they'll work through it.
That's wonderful. I'll chip in here for a second. So my background originally, when I was sort of getting deep into things in my doc program, was with dyad reading, and Morgan and colleagues 2000, they sort of investigated this of if we're doing paired synchronous reading with peers in a classroom, what level of difficulty material would have the best outcomes, and they did, I think it was 2, 3, and 4, or maybe it was 1, 2, and 3 levels above the student's independent reading level, and the data from that showed that the students that were above grade level, that were reading above grade level text, performed better than those who were reading grade level text. And then a follow up to that in 2018 with Brown and colleagues, and my chair, Dr. Moore, was part of that study as well, of sort of investigated that with 2, 3, and 4 grade levels above the lower level readers, the peer tutors reading, and they found that above grade level performed better again, and that 2 grade levels was the sort of the sweet spot. And Chase, you've done research with Read to Impress, and Tim, you've been in some of that Read to Impress research as well, where you've done a grade level above the 2T's reading level and seen really good results as well.
Yeah, that really came from a researcher kind of conversation when we were talking. It's we sat down and we were testing these methods, obviously, over the years, and it goes back to what Tim said. We're offering such support that they're succeeding, so why not push it as high as we can, and to the point where they're reading even grade level material for the first time in their lives, and they're reading it successfully, which is not only great for just their reading achievement and improvement, but also their confidence, which is, think about it. They have never read on grade level, and all of a sudden they sound great and they're performing well. There's a lot of research that says, like you said, that, the more challenging, even into frustrational. I don't know if you guys saw that, the webinar Tim Shanahan did for International Literacy Association on text complexity. But he went through a whole lot of research about this and how we should be challenging our text, and even challenging the notion of this 95% and where it came from, and seems arbitrary. And I don't want to get controversial, but there is research. I went to a presentation, back when we were allowed to go to presentations, and some people from Ohio State were like, we found that 89% accuracy, but kids who read books with 89%, they were the ones that made the greatest gains. And according to the lines, they would be considered frustrational when considering accuracy. So,
Jason, I want to follow up on your note about confidence. I think that's huge. These kids who struggle, they know who they are. They see how they read compared to their classmates, and that idea of them reaching a point where they can read just as well as any reader in the class is just really inspiring. I know in our reading clinic we have kids perform at the end of our summer program. They perform for grandparents and moms and dads, and just to see them, the confidence that they come out of that with, their chest sticking out. I'm a good reader. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of that. I remember Carol Chomsky writing about that in her classic study, After Decoding Then What. The idea of reaching that level of proficiency is something that is quite empowering for those children.
Absolutely. And that's where the power of repeated readings, I think, comes in, because if you have a struggling reader and you work with them on the Gettysburg Address again and again and again, they'll get it, and they can sound exactly like everyone else in the class. They can read it with language. And that's where some of the work in Reader's Theater that you both have done, I think that's a lot of the power in that, is it's offering those students a repeated reading of a complex text for an authentic purpose where they can perform it.
Mm-hmm. And you'll notice in Reader's Theater, when you implement it consistently, that those students who have traditionally been struggling, they realize the amount of practice they get and how they can stand next to their peers and sound just like anybody else. You can't even pick them out of the lineup. It's like, who's the struggling reader here? And you don't even know. But when they find that out, they start picking the lead roles every single time. I want to be narrator one. I want to be Lysander, whoever it is. And that's because they know that they're going to have more opportunity to show how fantastic they are. I just love that.
Yeah. And if you're a teacher looking for Reader's Theater script, Chase's website has tons of Reader's Theater scripts. Thebestclass.org, I think, isn't that your site?
Yes. Yeah, bestclass.org.
Chase is one of the most modest people I know, and that's reflected in the name of his website, The Best Class.
That was a big shout out to my second graders in 2006. Who unanimously chose that as our classroom website.
Oh, that's great.
Wonderful. Well, let's keep trucking. Now it's my turn for a shout out. I guess we all get a shout out. Casey Rowley is our next question, and she used to teach across the hall from me when I was in the classroom. And she's a third grade teacher, one of the earliest listeners of the podcast. And she's someone that has just latched on to thinking about how researchers are talking about things and trying to align her instruction accordingly. And I think she's doing a fantastic job at it. And she has a question I think is really important. What are some ways to keep the kids who are well above benchmark progressing?
Well,
go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, it depends upon what you mean by well above benchmark in terms of reading speed, or are they just hyper fluent? They can read anything with great expression and confidence, and that. To me, the note that I wrote down here in response to Casey's question was just the notion of keeping it authentic, finding real reasons for kids to engage in fluency practice. So finding those kinds of materials that they want to engage in, keep doing what you're doing, I suppose, is a good way of saying that. But it's the motivation. So kids aren't just trying to become faster all the time. They're trying to become expressive in their reading, in their oral language, and finding things such as poetry, Reader's Theater scripts, even songs. Are just, those artful and authentic ways of making this happen in a classroom, knowing that the kids are going to progress in terms of fluency and overall reading achievement, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when considering it overall, and those are great suggestions. That's exactly, make sure you have top-notch, awesome Tier 1 reading fluency instruction, and they'll continue to grow. But it sounds like you keep doing what you're doing, but also wide reading is one of those things that's going to help too. And, the other thing that I would recommend is that, some of these well above benchmark students don't get met with or the attention some of the other students in the class. So if you want to continue to push the needle on these kids, you want to spend the same amount of time with them as you do with any that you feel that need extra support.
Good point.
Absolutely. And I'll chip in there. I'm assuming she's referring to, a common, fluency screener. And we think about fluency, and it sort of has three major constructs, right, of accuracy, rate or automaticity or smoothness, and then prosody. And those screeners typically they hit two of those. They hit accuracy and rate, but right. they don't have prosody in there. And so I think that's if you do have readers that are high achievers in two of the three areas according to your screener, then I think pushing them with prosody and giving them those authentic, rich, complex texts and helping them get to a point where they're reading those with prosody would be a good way to. There's not really an upper limit at that point, because you can always read more complex texts with more expression, and I think that could be a great way to help those quote unquote high achievers still be moving along.
Let me throw a little bit of a wrench in here. What about those kids though who are the NASCAR readers? They read so fast, you're not really understanding what it is that they read. I still remember one of our students in a reading clinic, actually a couple of second graders coming in, and the clinicians were working with them and gave them a passage to read. And both of these children looked up at the clinicians that said something to this effect: am I supposed to read this as fast as I can? And what do we do with those kids? Because we're seeing more and more of those kids, they're reading fast, but not for the purpose of making meaning. They're reading fast for the purpose of reading fast. What do we do with those kids?
Perhaps that's a side effect of what I mentioned at the top of the episode, where sometimes in practice, whether intentional or not, that things have been tweaked from maybe how things were talked about, how fluency has been talked about in research. That's speculation on my part. But for the kid that's a speed reader, I think with them it's going to take, we know that they can process the text with automaticity, but with them we're going to have some coaching on if they're doing it that way. They're probably not doing it with a lot of expression, but they might take some coaching of let's think about the things that good readers do. Let me share with you things that I notice good readers do. Listen to my model. Now let's have you try that again and slow down a little bit. And then I think with them too, it's going to be including little chunks of comprehension in there as well to help make the connection that we don't just want devourers of print. We're looking for someone that as they're consuming the print, that they're processing it in a way that they can attend to the meaning, which is ultimately, the outcome of why we read.
Right. And, I don't want to play host here, but that really goes into questions by Stephanie and Liz, both from areas of New York of, their kids just reading and skipping words and just trying to get it done. And you guys have done a wonderful job of explaining that. And you mentioned comprehension in there. Sometimes it's a simple conversation with kids. That's the wonderful thing. I remember I was a reading specialist and they sent a kid who was, read real monotone and choppy. And I sat down with him just kind of informally. I was like, well, why don't you read like you talk? And he goes, oh, I'm supposed to do that. And, he was exited and that was done. But other times, it's a little more complicated than that. But I like to talk to the kids and be like, why are you reading like a bear is chasing you? What is going on? And then we get into the purpose of reading and the main goal of reading and understanding. And then it comes back to purpose. It's like, so set a purpose. Why are we reading? And fortunately, some kids have internalized the fact that reading means getting done and doing it as fast as you can. That's a shame.
Yeah, Jake, you mentioned, I love the reading like a bear is chasing you. But what you mentioned, Jake, about this notion of modeling, and I think that really is critical. One of the things we can do as teachers, parents, is to model fluent reading for our kids, read to our kids. And of course, one of the things I often say when I have a chance to speak to my students is that, of course, you want to talk about what you read, the content, but occasionally talk about how you read it. Did you notice how I slowed down here, or had a dramatic pause, or I raised the volume of my voice? And kids need to know this. And even sometimes do the opposite, do a negative example, read something as fast as you can for 2 or 3 sentences to your students. And, you're going to get some rolling eyes looking at you. And of course, the response is, what's wrong? I got all the words right. Isn't that good enough? And of course, no, we don't understand what you just read to us, and of course, the message is if I read this way and you don't enjoy it or understand it, then you shouldn't be reading that way as well.
Yeah, I think back to, was it R.J. Samuels, barking at print is not reading? That's...
Yeah. And then back to what Farrell, 66, it was, listen, my child, and you shall read.
Yeah. I think there's great power in repeated readings. How often do we, text is a one-stop show and we move on, but with being able to do those repeated readings, that allows the student to mimic your model and see how I paused there or see how I raised my voice there. Now you try it, but also for some of those speed readers where we do want to do some work with comprehension to kind of help them make that transition to thinking about making meaning from text. Targeted close reads or close reading, that's what it's all about, is let's read this text multiple times and have a shifting purpose with each kind of read to build comprehension. And so it's so, I just think fluency and comprehension can go so hand in hand that it doesn't have to be this either or thing that we sometimes make it to be. We can have all of it because good readers do all of it.
Jake, you just blew my mind. You brought me back to my doc program. When you said shifting purposes, it brought me back to Kusser. I was reading Kusser, and in there was an example, and it was a story, and it was like, I want you to just read this story. So I read through the story, and it was like, I walked into the house, and I saw my guitar, and there was a washer and dryer. I passed the washer and dryer, and I sat down, and I picked up my remote, and I turned on the TV, And it went on, and I was like, okay, great. And then the next line said, now read this as if you were a robber, if you were about to burgle this house. And I was like, that's crazy. So now I'm like, oh, what kind of TV is it? Was that a stacked washer and dryer? Are these rentals? What's going on? Like, so it was pretty powerful to just shift that purpose, even though the main purpose is to understand. If we go in with a different perspective, sometimes it gets us thinking a little bit more.
You really ease. That's what I love about Fluency too, is it's so easy because it's support in connected text that we're providing as a teacher. It so easily can blend into so much else we're doing during the day. Content area, reading a math question.
We need to write a teaching tip called shifting purposes and repeated reading.
I'm down. I think that's on my list of studies I'd love to do sometime. Fun. So,
well, and the other point on this is, we often associate with prosody with oral reading, which we do, but I think we need to help kids make the connection that the way you read orally reflects the way you read silently as well. Many of us actually, admit to hearing voices when we read that voices ourselves. I love this quote by Maya Angelou. I had to pull it up as I was listening to you guys talk here. In her poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she says, words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with shades of deeper meaning. And I think that is so true. I mean, it's our voice, whether it's oral or silent, that adds meaning to the words that we encounter when we read. And we need to work on that with our students.
That's beautiful. I love that. We've got a pair of questions coming up next. And the first one is, so kind of taking from what does fluency look like, perhaps pre-fluency for some really young kiddos? And then what things should we be thinking about with fluency in more of a secondary or even a post-secondary context? So Kristen D is asking that as a kindergarten teacher, she's doing a lot of work with phonemic awareness and phonics. But she says, of course, most students at this age are not reading much yet, but do we want their pre-reading skills that are being taught, hearing, identifying beginning, middle, and ending sounds, to be fluent? Is focus on fluency more of a focus with all older students? It just sounds like she's wanting to sort of frame what might fluency look like in a kindergarten setting.
Well, I can tell you how I taught my kids how to read before they started school. We did repeated reading there, but I intentionally chose texts that were appropriate for the children. Nursery rhymes, short poems, plays with sounds, tongue twisters. And so what would happen was I would read to them a couple times, and then I would invite them to read along with me. And then eventually I would say, okay, now you guys read it to me. And essentially, but they had the text memorized. But, we were keep trying to point them to the words as they were reading them. And really doing this on a regular basis, they begin to build their sight vocabulary, begin to play with sounds. I mean, if you think about it, why do we have nursery rhymes? I think some people suggest it's because they help develop that phonemic awareness in kids. So we're doing everything at once with these rhymes, getting kids to the point where they can read them on their own. There was a study that was done by Bruce Stevenson, a dissertation study with at-risk first graders. And basically taught parents to do this at home, 10 minutes a night, teaching them a nursery rhyme. We went through a process of parents, you read, then we read, and then they have them read to you, and then do a little bit of word study with it. And what he found is that in 3 months' time, these kids went from essentially being non-readers, with their words correct per minute was less than one. That was in August. By November, they were up to 25 words correct per minute, which is, in Ohio, that's our benchmark for January, I believe. And yet nobody ever told them to read fast. They just did this, chose the right kinds of material that lent themselves to younger children. And I think that's the key, is what kinds of material are appropriate for different age levels.
I love that. Chase, did you want to chip in anything on that?
Yeah, funny. My experience also comes from my child. My kindergartner, he was in kindergarten when he went off for spring break and never went back to school again due to the pandemic. And I used materials that Tim's talking about, like nursery rhymes and funny little poems by like Ken Nesbitt that you can find online, and little books and things. And I did read intervention that we've been playing with, that it's very similar. It's kind of like, you read the book to them, then you kind of choral read it together, and then they read it back to you. So I did that every day with him. And it was very surprising when he went back to first grade, and, everybody was like, oh gosh, we've lost so much. And this teacher looks at me and goes, how did he grow a year during the pandemic? What happened? And so I shared that research with him as well. And so, I mean, again, it's just materials and derived from repeated readings.
So small world. I have a kindergartner, or I had a kindergartner that didn't finish school in March from the pandemic, and he wanted to read Harry Potter. With my class, I was doing the first Harry Potter as a read aloud and online, and we were doing that, and we listened through that, and then he wanted to read the second Harry Potter, and I was like, okay. And I thought, no, we can do this. So we used Read to Impress is what we did with it. And so I would read, and I would just have him read right after, just a sliver after me. I just keep a pace ahead of him. And I didn't have him, with Read to Impress, where there's this paired synchronous reading, and then the lower level reader goes back and rereads part of it. I would just have him reread a sentence because he was in kindergarten, but and we confession, we didn't finish all of the Chamber of Secrets.
No way.
but he's doing phenomenal as a reader. So perhaps in thinking about it in a kindergarten or really young setting is we tend to have that pendulum that swings back and forth, and so it's not necessarily that we're going to throw out phonemic awareness and phonics instruction. We're not kicking that to the curb, but is there room for a dose of oral reading fluency? And could that also really be, connected with, comprehension work as well? Is there a dose? Is there a room for that in kindergarten? And I would argue, yeah, there is room for that alongside important or, those crucial skills like phonemic awareness and phonics. And those can even be integrated in with some of that instruction as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's that poem by, I can't remember who wrote it, but it also teaches spelling and phonics, and it's got rhyming. It's called Swimming Ool. Swimming in the swimming pool is where I like to be, wearing underwater goggles so that I can see. Before I swim, I drank a cup of tea. Now the swimming pool's a swimming ool because I took a pee.
Yeah.
Teaches letters, phonemic awareness, like this poem has it all. You can use it all
inferencing.
It's a curriculum.
That's a keeper. That's a good one. All right, so then let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Melissa Garside, her question was long, so I'm going to summarize it, but it's really a great question. So she starts out her question by saying, I know that it's generally much more difficult to improve reading fluency for older/adolescent readers. So she's asking if there's limited instruction time, especially for teachers at a secondary level, what factors should a secondary SPED or intervention teacher consider as they determine how to make the most impact on improving reading outcomes for students with disabilities? Is there a point at which working on reading fluency will not result in meaningful outcomes? And I think outcomes there we can maybe define for students. If so, what criteria would a teacher use to determine whether to continue work on fluency or focus on different skills and strategies? So thinking secondary lens, and then specifically students with disabilities.
Well, first of all, just acknowledge the fact that, and thanks for doing this. We have students at the secondary level who are not sufficiently fluent. You look at some of these standards across the states, the Common Core standards, they usually identify fluency as a grades 1 through 5 competency. But if students are not fluent by the end of grade 5, they don't automatically become fluent. It needs to be something that we continue to be concerned about. And the thing is, as noted in this question, a lot of our secondary teachers are not familiar with fluency. The assumption is, well, kids have conquered this during their elementary and middle grades. So it's something that we do need to be concerned about. I guess what I would simply say is that good teaching is good teaching. Those same basic principles that we use in the elementary grades apply to the secondary. The key is to find the material that would be appropriate for students at those levels. If you're going to work on poetry, instead of nursery rhymes, how about poetry by Carl Sandburg or Emily Dickinson or Robert Service, the cremation of Stan McGee. Having kids work on that kind of material, it can be quite inspiring, I think, for kids. What do you think, Chase?
I agree. It's we need to write another book called The Handbook of Reading Fluency Interventions for secondary grades.
Yeah.
But it'll be the same as the handbook for elementary grades. We'll just use less cute font and photos. But I think I'll give an example. The neurological impress method has been around since the 60s. And while there's a lot of positive results, there's sometimes it didn't work. And that's just the nature of the beast. Not everything's going to work for everybody. But I remember when I was a reading specialist, a teacher in the school had a son who had been receiving special education services his entire life. And he was in middle school at the time. And she asked me, she says, what can I do? Like, he's never passed a standardized reading test, the state test. And I know that's a concern for secondary teachers as well. So I recommended neurological impress. And she took it to heart, and she did it for a year, 15 minutes a night during the week. And she came back to me emotional, crying, and said he had passed the test for the first time ever. And she gave me a hug and patted me, and I'm not real good at that. So it was a little awkward for me, but, and she was like, you were put on this earth for me. Yeah. And I was like, no, it's research. I mean, it's just out there. I reached into the cloud and pulled out, maybe this one will work. And it happened to work for him. And it was amazing. And it changed the trajectory of his academic career and lots of things like that. But neurological impresses, we use it all the way.
Well, and do you recall what this mom was reading with her son?
She actually, it was whatever chapter books that he would choose, because he wanted to read the chapter books. And she ended up buying 2 copies of each one, because the original neurological impress recommendation is to sit right next to the child, grab onto their hand. But now we're talking about middle schoolers, high schoolers. It's probably not going to be appropriate. They're probably not going to, we don't want to baby them. I don't want to, for lack of a better word. So they sat across from each other, each with a text doing neurological impress. Yeah.
But again, the point is you don't have to dumb down the text for the kids.
No.
And kids know it when you give stuff that's may be insulting to them. It's just the stuff that he wanted to read, and all the mom did was provide that support so that he could negotiate the text.
And I think in a secondary context where recently there's been a lot of emphasis on content area literacy, I don't know that we can expect our students to just automatically learn how to read a chemistry textbook or a social studies textbook. There might be room for fluency in content area literacy in a secondary context, because sentences get a lot more complex. There's a lot more multi-syllabic words, and the syntax starts to become a little bit different. Or even you think reading To Kill a Mockingbird. So there's still, I think, a little bit of room for that. I would ask though, is, if we're talking about a student who, I guess, is there a place where we just say, this kid's rate is their rate wherever they're at, even though it's below benchmark, that it's just where they're going to get, and we're just going to focus on other things? Or do we say, no, getting to a place where students can read smoothly, accurately, and with expression is kind of a non-negotiable, regardless of where they're at, of what grade they're in? Or is there nuance and somewhere in between?
There's always nuance, but I think it's something that we just can't throw our hands up and say, well, we can't get them there. We can find ways of, if not getting them to that standard, at least getting them close, seeing improvement, and doing it in authentic sort of ways. I think is really challenging. You mentioned science, Jake, and Chase, Broad Bagger, don't you?
Oh yeah, Broad.
He's a
we
poet.
Stole a microphone from him a few years back.
Well, he's a poet who used to be a district attorney in New Orleans, and but he writes poetry now for children, and he's been writing poetry around science topics. I forget the exact name of the program, but it's really quite sophisticated what he writes about. So a great way of getting kids in science and building fluency at the same time. I'm going to mention another guy too, and Chase, you know him, Jim Nageldigger.
Yeah.
Jim is a professor now in Elmira College in New York, but he worked with me here at Kent, and he did a dissertation study on theater students, and he found that a number of students got into theater as a result of, or they didn't get into theater because they had a reading problem, but they found that their reading improved significantly once they got into theater. Whether you're an actor or the stage manager or whatever you are, what do you do when you're in theater? You have to you read a text repeatedly until you have it read automatically and expressively, but again, in a very authentic sort of way. So again, we have programs out there at the secondary level for kids to get into, theater, chorus. Most of these are extracurricular activities, but there's a hidden agenda there then, and that hidden agenda is we're going to improve your reading.
And we know that readers theater works as well. It's very similar to theater, except you don't memorize the lines, and anything can become a script. I mean, my students in second grade always did the water cycle strip, and they always fought over who was going to be the sewage treatment plant. But, that's who they wanted to be. But I mean, you can turn anything into a script in high school. I mean, you take a Wikipedia page, it'd be super boring, but I mean, you can add narrators to it and some sort of performance. So yeah, that's something that can be integrated into pretty much anything. We did it in math. We did this readers theater math word problems, which was really awesome because they become like each sentence would be a new narrator. And then all the kids that weren't performing were sitting there trying to do the problem, but they had the ability to ask a narrator to read again. And what that did is it showed where the important information was and where the erroneous information was. Yeah. So it had a lot of unintended positive consequences.
Yeah, I teach a course here at the university for it's called phonics for middle school teachers and upper elementary teachers, but we have a good dose of fluency in there. And I have the students write readers theater scripts or poetry around their area of expertise. And it's so neat to see the creativity when students easy to create a readers theater script out of a social studies unit. Mm-hmm. But when you create a science or social studies, the science or mathematics readers theater script where the characters are polygons and triangles and rectangles, and they get into this argument about which is which. I mean, that is so cool. That's, again, that to me, the creativity, the art that we need to be encouraging in our teachers and students for that matter.
You're absolutely right. And we got to continue on this because it's super important. I walked into a classroom one time and they were like, okay, Mr. Readers Theater, what can we do here? It was a science class. And they were comparing and contrasting different animal or species. And there was they had the Venn diagram going. And they said, how are we going to do this? And I said, well, yeah, we're going to set up we're going to write Readers Theater script debates. And it's similar to what you were saying, Tim. And I remember one of them, and it's still posted on my website, where they were comparing and contrasting a squid and a stick bug. And the script they wrote is actually still on my site. And they're talking smack and talking the different characteristics of each other. It's like, hey, but at least I can, hey, I don't live in the water, and talking about habitat. Now they threw in some weird stuff like, I don't know, like one of them said he could rap better than the other, but that was a nice addition to, just make the script a little more engaging.
Well, and think of what the kids had to do. They had to dig in and do some research and learning about stick bugs and whatever, and the other bug you were talking about.
Squid.
But they had an authentic reason to actually do that. We're putting on a play. We have to have a good script for it.
I love it. I love it. Authentic purposes, repeated readings, writing, research. It's all integrated. I love it.
I remember listening. Once you get going down this, it's hard to stop. But
it is. I
still remember Henry Winkler giving a talk at the when it was the International Reading Association several years ago. He was a guest speaker, and he talked about himself. He wrote those Hank Zimfer books about a kid who's having reading problems, and he said, "That's me." He grew up with reading problems. And if I'm not mistaken, he said it was when he was in junior high school that he finally turned himself around. And what happened? He joined the drama club. And he found that he could actually have an outlet for his goofiness, but also it required him to actually engage in meaningful repeated readings, and of course he could be the star then as well.
Part two of Melissa's question is she wants to know about reading norms. She states that reading norms are readily available for grades 1 through 8, but she says that she hasn't seen reading norms for grades 9 through 12. So what are reasonable expectations of what to shoot for reading norms? And I think that's work both of you are doing right now. So what would reading norms look like for 9 through 12?
Well, right now, what I tell my students is just extrapolate, to take that 7th and 8th grade norm and add 5 words correct per minute per year to the norms is reasonable. But that's just plain guessing. Now, what Chase and I and David Page are doing, we're engaging in a study this fall where basically I asked one of the questions is, what would be the level of automaticity or reading rate, if you will, that you would expect out of a successful college graduate? So what our intention is to collect oral reading fluency data of college graduates, see what that reading rate is, and then interpolate what the rates might be for kids at 12th grade, 11th grade, 10th grade, 9th grade. And hopefully that might give some indication of that, where we would expect kids to be. So that's our current project.
Yeah, coming at you summer 2022 or 23, depending on how many revisions we have to make.
Yeah. Sure.
And I would make a plug there too, that's where the a fluency scale could come in handy as well, where if there's not clear-cut defined norms for a specific age or specific population, that scale still, I think, will work really well to take an idea of where your kiddos are at, of are they reading with prosody, how is their smoothness. That could be a way to also kind of triangulate where they're at with their fluency.
Yeah, great point. That whatever scale or rubric you use, it's appropriate at every grade level, because what appropriate reading sounds like at 12th grade or 1st grade or 5th grade or whatever.
Let's work on wrapping up the show here. I'm sure we could go longer, but I don't know if anyone wants to listen to a 3-hour podcast episode with us. One question is, and this is from Emily, and she's a pre-service teacher. So props to a pre-service teacher who's interested in reading fluency and reading research. So that's fantastic, Emily. She's just asking, what are your best tips and tricks for teaching fluency to a struggling student? And obviously it's kind of been intertwined with our whole conversation, but perhaps this can kind of be our final statements on how do we do this? How do we help kids with reading fluency in the classroom?
Prior to Tim taking this one away, she also asked, how do I get books for my classroom, I believe. And I just wanted to throw out an idea. It's called the garage sale ticket. On Saturday mornings, you drive around as a new teacher and you just have a little card that says, I'm a new teacher. My name is so-and-so, Emily, and here's my number. And if you have any books left over at the end of the day, I will come by and pick them up. And then you can go back on your same route and pick up all the books that haven't been purchased.
I love that. I'll chip in just thrift books as well. You can get super cheap used copies from libraries in great condition for $4 or $5 a book. So that's a cheap way to do it. And I did a few donors choose projects to get books for my classroom as well. And they were really well funded because, I think people in the community, they believe in having books in classrooms. So those are a couple quick pointers, Emily.
Great. I'll throw out Chase's website again, thebestclass.org. Although he doesn't post books up there, what his second graders did years ago was they took the books that they read and they turned them into scripts. And what a natural way of getting kids into reading a text more than once and using an authentic book as a mentor text for writing. So thebestclass.org. Does it still require a password, Chase?
No, the password's gone. The person who is attacking my site is gone.
Okay. But if you ever require a password again, it's teacher?
Teacher. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It'll always be teacher if I have to put it back on.
All right. Okay, I'll take a crack at Emily's question. What are the best tips for struggling readers? We've kind of been dancing around this all along, but I'm going to put out a shout out for both Chase and myself. Chase and I wrote a book a few years ago for Teachers College Press where we looked at intervention at different fluency interventions at different levels. So what tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions look like. And I think we talked about one of the tier 2, we talked about my fluency development lesson, basically a lesson where kids learn to read something well every single day, usually a short text, and it involves the teacher modeling the text, the kids reading it chorally with the teacher, practicing with a partner, and eventually performing it every day, and then performing it and doing this every day with a different text. We've gotten some we use it in our reading clinic as our core lesson. And we've gotten some really nice results of that. We've actually published some research on that. And Chase, I think you wrote the tier 3 intervention for that book.
Yeah. So
tiered fluency instruction, I think we called it.
Yeah, tiered fluency instruction. And there was several on tier 2, and FDL was in there. And then for tier 3, we went through repeated readings in various different ways and examples, as well as neurological impress, neurological impress plus, which is there's an additional reading comprehension. We added read to impress, actually, and a lot of those like read to impress and things are going to be available on my website as well under downloads. One of the things that we did Read Like Me after that one, and Jake and I are actually working on a project called Read Like Us, where I got an email from actually several asking, hey, a lot of the tier 3 interventions are one-on-one, and we just can't. We have too many struggling students. We cannot meet with them one-on-one constantly. Well, the first thing I would say is we can when we did reading together intervention, we trained everybody, parents, the secretary up front, the librarian, paras that had breaks, so that they could all do this one-on-one. But again, if that's not feasible, Jake and I are working on something called Read Like Us that we're testing out in Utah, which is similar to, it follows a similar format. Jake, you want to describe that one?
Yeah, the idea with Read Like Us, Chase had an article with was it a doc student you did Read Like Me with?
No, it was actually an undergraduate student.
Oh, okay. Wow. An undergraduate student, and is a 2020 publication. And so trying to scale Read Like Me to Read Like Us, it follows, really it's integrating repeated readings in complex connected text using a gradual release format where the teacher is modeling it, is modeling the reading once, and then the group goes through choral reads of it, and then it progresses a little bit at a time to eventually where the reader at the end, individually, they go and read that to somebody else, and their goal is to read it smoothly, accurately, and with expression is kind of the nuts and bolts with it. I'll put a plug in for that, for the tiered fluency book from both of you. That was one of my early episodes. That was the first time you were on the podcast, Chase. We were talking about that book. It was like episodes 4 or 5 if folks want to go back and listen to it. But it's a short little read. It's really accessible for a practitioner level to kind of get an idea of what different levels of intensity of fluency support might look like. And from there, springboard off, and you can go and do more, research in any of those individual areas. But I hope that's a book that eventually, gets a second edition or something as more of these kind of continue to evolve. And they'll sort of have core ingredients that are similar across them, but it's different ways to provide an intensity of support and different approaches to implementation that provides, I think folks in whatever, sort of cultural milieu they have with what reading instruction is, there's something in that book for every single reading teacher. It's a great little book.
Hey, thanks, Jake.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Hey, can I mention one more thing though before we close it out? And the question I found in one of the questions, I can't find it specifically right now, but the question was this: comprehension. Do we teach fluency just for the sake of fluency? I think the models of reading instruction suggest that fluency leads to comprehension. And Chase, I'm going to give this one to you because you've actually done some research on that where you found that, we've in your research that kids have actually improved in their fluency. But the bigger question is, did you see any changes in comprehension?
Yeah, absolutely. We have. Now the effects on using a reading fluency intervention, obviously the effects were much greater on the reading fluency outcomes, but we also saw moderate effects on their improved reading comprehension as well as their overall reading growth, which could be attributed to the fluency intervention, which is why I'm starting to think, I'm like, why don't we just call these reading interventions?
Yeah, good point.
I love it. I'll chip in on that point too. I'm thinking of John Sabatini and colleagues, was it 2018 or 2019? But they looked at NAEP data from the special NAEP study that included oral reading fluency, and this was obviously correlational, but they found across the board that the higher, the most efficient readers, the ones with the highest levels of fluency on the NAEP scale, were also the highest comprehenders. And I believe they did found a little bit of a curvilinear pattern, meaning that it was a little bit of an S shape, that there was a threshold where below which there was a little bit more noise, where I guess they said there was a threshold where fluency really starts to improve comprehension. And then there's also an upper threshold where more fluency did start to level off. But for the vast majority of students, the fluency did support their comprehension. And that, I think there's a caveat there that I'll get to in a second, but even in my dissertation where I meta-analyzed 60 years of paired synchronous oral reading methods like paired reading, dyad reading, read to impress, and NIM, my research found that the effect size for comprehension was actually larger than the effect size for the fluency measures, which I think speaks to why we care about fluency, because we do want the automaticity and the expression so that our minds can focus on making meaning. But I think the caveat there goes back to teaching fluency just for fluency's sake, that we can't neglect the actual work in comprehension. We can't think that I'm just going to improve my kids in fluency forever and have the back door to comprehension. There is a point where there's a dose of it. We want to be supporting our kids in fluency, but we also want to be supporting kids in making meaning. So I hope folks don't confuse that if I just endlessly improve their fluency, that I'm sort of off the hook for comprehension. I think it needs both.
Well said.
So wrapping up, I think, is there anything else we want to mention on? We kind of just got off on the tiered fluency instruction book, which has quite a bit in there. Any other last?
Yeah, I've got a little bit of advice, and it's going to come from our upcoming book, Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading, along with Rasinski and Page. We talked very specifically about some concrete examples that you can use for reading fluency interventions, tier 1 fluency instruction in your classrooms. But in this next book, we show you, demonstrate, and also encourage you to make the modifications that meet the needs of your students, that motivate your students. You don't have to follow step 1 through 17 if it's not improving or appropriate for your students. So that's where we want you to take what we've done and spin it with your own art and implement things that best meet the needs of your context and your students.
I love that. I'll chip in. I guess my last thought here is simplifying perhaps what we're doing during the reading day. Sometimes I feel that teachers they feel like they have to have one set of texts for when they're doing like comprehension instruction, and one set of texts when they're doing more fluency, and then they have the text that they're doing for science, and the text that they're doing for their writing instruction, and the text that they're doing for social studies. And I think a lot of this can be simplified, that if I have a text and it doesn't matter whether I'm in science, I can still be supporting oral reading fluency in really small, simple ways. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be this massive dose of fluency all at one time, but I can be incorporating that in little ways throughout the different texts that I'm using. And a single text, it can have multiple different purposes. And again, I think I've been chipping in on repeated readings, how big a fan I am of those. But I think simplifying and using one text for multiple purposes could help teachers just relax a little and take a breath, because then they can focus on the text, which is what ultimately we want, is to be able to derive meaning from that text in efficient ways.
Tim,
Yep.
Last words.
You guys took all my words away from me. So I say here. I love how you ended with Chase, the idea that, we've discovered that fluency is a science. It's scientific evidence to support it. But as you said, and Jake, you implied as well, it's an art as well. And finding that you don't have to go out and buy some fluency program. The materials are already in front of us. If you're interested in poetry, go to Ken Nesbitt's, David Harrison's, Brad Baggart's poetry sites, Reader's Theater Scripts, go to Chase's, and use that as inspiration to create your own material and have kids write their own poetry and their own scripts. I mean, that to me is what school is all about. That's what I remember about being in school, writing scripts and then getting in trouble for it. But we should be encouraging kids to be authentic in that sort of way, and teachers as well. So be artful as well as scientific.
I think we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have
Absolutely.
really rich, rigorous instruction, and we can have it for authentic purposes. We don't have to choose between the two.
Absolutely.
All right. It's been a pleasure talking with both of you, Dr. Chase Young and Dr. Timothy Rasinski. We'll be looking forward to your book, Artfully Teaching the Science of Reading with David Page, and maybe I'll just book you guys for an interview right when we're done, and then so we know that that's on the schedule. But I appreciate your time, and best of luck to you in all of your endeavors.
Thanks for having us, Jake.
A great big thanks to Dr. Young and Dr. Rasinski for joining me on the Teaching Literacy podcast. My 2 cents, I'm just going to chip in one big cent. I already talked a lot during the episode, but I think what I mentioned there at the very end deserves a little bit more attention. And I basically said that we can have our cake and eat it too. And what I meant by that is we can have really rich, supportive, rigorous instruction, and we can do it in ways that are meaningful for the student and that are using authentic purposes and authentic texts. And I don't think those two things or those three things are mutually exclusive. I think we can have it all. But I think what it takes to have it all is it takes our expertise as educators of just using authentic text or using inauthentic text for that matter, or using this program or that program or this curricula or that curricula. That in and of itself is not going to make sure that the students are getting the support they need. Great steps, but not necessarily going to guarantee those outcomes. I think what does guarantee that we are providing our students the rich support that they need is our own expertise as educators. And so I applaud you listening to this episode, because it's clear that you are someone who cares about honing your craft and about becoming a better educator and being able to support your students in the best way possible. And I think as you continue to develop your expertise, you'll be able to take whatever materials, whatever standards, whatever things that you're required to teach. I think you can take those and you can make it better in your classroom for your students. And that's my 1 cent instead of 2 cents for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Teaching Literacy Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, the best thing you can do is just to share it with a colleague. Say, hey, here's a recent episode I listened to on reading fluency. I thought it was really great. You might enjoy it too. Take a listen and let's chat afterward and talk about what you learned, or talk about what things stuck out with you. This could be a great PLC starter or a way that I hope episodes like this are starting conversations among colleagues and are the beginning of a learning journey rather than perhaps the end all be all summative. This is what we all have to say on reading fluency. So thank you very much for listening to the podcast, and until next time, let's go and teach reading just a little bit better.